Hey everybody, we've reached the end of the month, so we're going to recap some of the great conversations that have been going on in the Humanizing Work community. If you've had a busy month and haven't been able to stay as engaged with the community as you'd like, this recap should serve as a quick highlight reel for you.
We'll link to the original conversation in the description so you can go deeper on any topics that spark your interest, but here are the highlights for October of 2021.
All right, first Friday is our conference alumni community, and in that Zoom this month, we talked about goals. It's the time of year when people are starting to think a lot about annual goals, wrapping up on the current year and seeing how that went, looking forward to the next year. It turns out that over the past year, we've worked with a few of our clients to help them find ways to set good goals that are more complexity aware and human friendly than a lot of the traditional approaches.
Right. So in this particular session, we shared our scorecard approach. We've come up with like a goals scorecard. And the scorecard boils down what we know about what motivates us and what makes goals motivating into a few key things like autonomy, like the goal is really authentically ours. It's not an assignment. Like impact, I can see how working on this thing will have a positive impact for me, for my team, for customers. Growth, a little bit about growth, like we can demonstrate our competence, we're good at it, but we're still stretching a little bit. We share our 4% stretch approach there. And then feedback, can we do it in little small chunks and then learn whether we're being successful on the way? So we shared the scorecard approach. And then since this has been top of mind for us and with our clients, I've been using these concepts with my own goal setting, as well as applying them in other areas of my life. Like I work with a church youth group where they wanted to work on setting some goals. And these concepts have been really useful here. One community member who wasn't able to attend that session live used the recording of the session to workshop his goals with himself and a coworker. And he reported back that his goals were looking much more motivating and much less box checky now. And that's what we had hoped for with this content. And it's a good reminder that even if you can't make the live session, you can check the recordings later and still benefit from it. The second Friday of every month is our ScrumMasters and Coaches community. And this time we had a session topic around technical skills for Scrum Masters and coaches, a common question we get. But I wasn't there. So Richard should probably recap this one.
Yeah, so there's always that question of how technical do you need to be effective as a Scrum Master or a coach? Not one who's really explicitly coaching on technical practices or something, but just a overall Scrum Master or coach for a team. How technical do you need to be? Well, I've found that Scrum Masters and coaches tend to be split on how they came into the role. Some, like me, came from the technical side. And for the purpose of our conversation in that session, we defined technical as you can get into the details of the solution, like whatever the domain is. So it wasn't necessarily software developer or something. It's you can get into the weeds of what the team is working on. So on a marketing team, you're a marketing expert. So some people came from the technical side. Others come more from the process side of things, like maybe they were a project manager before. So at the start of the session, we did a little bit of a virtual where do you stand, like on that continuum from I'm totally on the process end, don't even understand the solution my team is building, to the other end, like I could probably get in there and work on it, or somewhere in between. It turned out that most of the group we had there was on the less technical side. They come from more of the process end of things, or like I often find myself now, it's been long enough since they were on the technical side that their experience feels less relevant. So then from there, we had a conversation about the challenges and the benefits of being on either side, just kind of treating it as a unique perspective. And finally, we talked about how if it's useful to have a little more understanding of the solution, how do you grow that, or how do you mitigate not being as much on that side? Because I think there is some leverage there. And so a few of the key takeaways for me, one was that there really is some leverage from coming from a technical background. And again, that means like you get the solution, whatever it is. But it turns out it's not really the solution expertise. It's the credibility that you get to leverage with solution people. And so there's something to that. Although another takeaway was that some people are really skilled at leveraging not having that and being able to ask the kind of stupid question. Like, I don't understand any of this, but it really doesn't make sense to me why that thing can't be split, or something like that. Like, explain it to me like I'm 5, like you say all the time, Peter. And then another kind of last takeaway was that there are ways to mitigate not having that expertise. And one that several people mentioned was finding allies you can pair with on things, like the technical person that you can have a side conversation with to understand something. And you don't necessarily have to get the skills yourself to be able to leverage that. So that was a really interesting session. Did not go the way I expected. I thought we'd have a more even group and people kind of more set in the benefit of their ways. And as always happens with our communities, people are really open and growth-minded. And so it was a lot of fun. So moving into week 3, third Fridays are our product owner community of practice meeting. And for this one, we did a session, kind of clickbaity title, 10 kinds of product assumption tests you should use this year and 2 you probably shouldn't. And we didn't say it, but there was the implied, you'll never believe number 4.
So this month it was kind of funny because Richard and I kind of switched our expertises, right? Where Richard usually takes the lead on the product owner stuff. I usually take the stuff on the lead on the Scrum Master and coaches stuff. We happened to be out opposite weeks this week, so it was fun to kind of cross-train a little bit and take the lead on those sessions that we normally might not have. In this session, we wanted to get into this idea of product assumption testing and really dig into why do we do it and what types of tests are useful. And this is a concept that we already teach in our advanced certified Scrum product owner course. We have a whole week where we focus on product assumption testing. And going into this Zoom session, this community session, we started with that same kind of Miro frame, the same board, the same content going into it. And Richard and I, before the session, got together and we kind of voted, like, wow, what are the 10 that we would recommend everybody should at least try, and
if you
what
could
are
only
the 2?
keep 10, as we do.
And we were fairly aligned, not 100% aligned, but what we found was that where we were unaligned on a specific test, we were still aligned on the pattern underneath it, that there were kind of categories of tests that we thought everybody should have at least one representative of this category of tests. So that's what we went into the session with, is some ideas around that. So we just wanted to remind people, because it turns out that most of the folks that attended that particular session had been at our advanced CSPO course. So it wasn't new content for them. And so we wanted to remind people a little bit of, here are some options that you should try. Maybe you haven't tried this one in a while. So more of a catalyst to say, if you haven't done this one in a while, take a look. Remember, because we all need that in all areas of our life. I find it useful to just get reminders of things like that. So I'm not going to go through each of the 10 as a key takeaway, but let's talk quickly about the 2 that we always recommend that you probably shouldn't, right? And one of those is the focus group, which is not a great test because of the way that people anchor themselves in that type of conversation. So whoever speaks first really anchors the conversation, and it really can multiply and flower from that one thing, and you get what looks like data. Well, everybody in the focus group said this, when really it might just be a whole bunch of cognitive biases playing into that, and the data might be very misleading. So focus groups, there are a category of tests that do the job of focus groups, but that category of tests has very kind of constrained facilitation approaches that mitigate those cognitive biases and still get the benefit of doing some workshopping of ideas and possibilities and things that we want to learn about in a group setting. The other one, of course, is surveys. I kind of feel like you should rant on this for just a minute, Richard, because you feel only more strongly about this than the other person I know that always recommends we don't do it, our friend Hart, who also feels strongly. I think your rant is longer than his, though.
That's a sign of a good rant.
Yeah.
Like, the thing I boil it down to is I realized that surveys were a bad idea in the context of a grad school course on survey design. It's like a qualitative research methods course. And as I realized how hard it is to write a good survey and how many other ways there are to get the same kind of data, my big takeaway was we probably shouldn't do this very much. And that was in 2003, I think, before you started getting a survey for everything in your life. And it's like I bought my car off the end of a lease recently, and I remember the salesperson saying, I have to get a perfect score on this or I don't get my bonus for the month. So I need you to say a 10, even if it's not quite true. Like, that's a survey that is not telling them anything. And that's kind of our experience of surveys right now. So I do not recommend surveys for pretty much anything. And so in that session, we talked about some alternatives. And I think that's probably helpful for people, especially in big companies who probably gravitate towards surveys.
Yeah. And so some takeaways around this was it was very useful just to review those as a refresher for the folks that made it to that community. You can check out the link and get a refresher on that yourself from the recording.
All right. Last one, moving on to our leaders community, which meets on the fourth Friday of the month. To get into highlights for October, we have to back up a month to the September leadership community session, which was about designing organizational change experiments. And at the very end of that session, one of the participants raised a question that was such a meaty topic that we decided to devote an entire session to it. And that was, how do you communicate about uncertainty as a leader when everybody wants certainty from you?
Including the leader
Yourself.
Themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all want certainty. So reflecting on this session, there were a few highlights. And as all of these topics do, it always takes some interesting paths. And we always see these topics from about 5 different perspectives by the end of the session. So again, always really useful to attend live, but you can check out the recording as well. One of the things that came up was the language that we use when we're communicating about uncertainty. For a while, there was this big trend to talk about failing fast. It's kind of a Silicon Valley phrase where, hey, we need to fail fast here. And other businesses, other organizations said, I hate that terminology. I don't want to fail. I want to learn. I want to be successful. If I can avoid failure, I would like to. And so that language didn't help. It wasn't that useful.
Yeah. I think they were trying to make it safe to try things.
Yeah.
Without realizing the side effects of that and the connotations of that. Because I've seen environments where that unlocked a lot of willingness to try things, especially in the early Agile days. But then having that coming from a leader who's saying like, I'm making this big bet on this thing, but we'll just fail fast. And you're like, wait, that's my livelihood. I don't think I want failure here.
And so there was like that era of fail fast was the thing, and then that started to die down. The next era that I noticed kind of coming out of the lean startup movement was about experimenting to learn. So instead of saying fail fast, we would say, well, let's experiment to learn. And then that again started to have some baggage attached to it as people said, what are you just like trying a bunch of stuff and running a bunch of experiments, or you're not guiding these experiments with anything, which was not the case at all. But people interpret these things the way that they interpret them. And I was listening to an interview actually with Shantanu Narayan, who's the CEO of Adobe, where I worked for a long time. I watched the interview much after I had left Adobe, years after. But he talked about this idea a little bit of fail fast, or how did you succeed in doing some of the business things that you had done. And Shantanu said that when he was making a decision, he didn't think about it as failing fast. He didn't think about it as running an experiment. He thought about it like investing from a financial standpoint. If I'm going to make an investment, what do? Well, I'm going to go research things. I'm going to gather as much data as I can. And then for any given investment, there's going to be some level of risk. There's going to be some upside, some downside. And so he thought of product testing and strategy and things like that from an investment standpoint. So using that language of what are we investing here and treating it like a financial investment was one of the key takeaways from this session for me, was that that's a useful set of language to use when we're communicating about uncertainty.
Another thing we ended up talking about that stuck out to me was how some of the things we teach about customer empathy will work when you're talking about things like organizational change and communication. I think the people that you are communicating to have their own jobs, pains, and gains that they're bringing to it, and they're sort of hiring or auditioning your communication to see if it can do some of those jobs for them or achieve some gains or avoid some pains. And so doing that empathy work first before trying to communicate about uncertainty, so you understand what do people really need from me, and then adjusting your communication, maybe even with different audiences, not in a disingenuous, manipulative way, but choosing what language you use and how you talk about something so that it speaks to what people actually need.
So that's kind of two angles on this idea of how do we communicate about uncertainty. One angle is if you are a leader facing uncertainty, how do you communicate to people who see you as a leader? How do you effectively lead in uncertainty? And then that second topic emerged from the flip of that. Well, what if I'm trying to influence leaders? And I see things as complex and that we're going to have to take iterative steps and experiment to learn, but they view the world with a little more of a complicated lens using the Cynefin terminology. So it was interesting to look at this topic from both directions, which was something we didn't expect going into it. And then people shared lots of examples of effective leadership in an uncertainty. Individual examples, people shared what had worked for them, things that they had tried. We looked at some of the case studies we look at where there are leaders that do really admirable things in times of uncertainty. And as people were sharing this, a pattern started to emerge where those leaders were doing certain things. They were taking certain steps. And this pattern emerged from curiosity about how open and vulnerable should a leader be when they recognize that there is uncertainty here. Because the far end of that spectrum is like, I don't know what's going to happen. Things could go really poorly here. That's not typically going to have a great leadership impact on an organization.
I want to trust that you know something. Yeah.
And so I was curious about like where are we vulnerable, where are we really transparent, and where do we do what we think of as traditional leadership in this situation and be kind of visionary and rally the troops. And what we realized is that leaders are very transparent and vulnerable about two parts of the situation. First, what is the context itself? What's going on around us that is causing us to take a stand on something? So being really open and vulnerable about here's what's going on in the world. And so context there. Then being really open about your own personal vision or goals or outcomes that you really hope occur given this context. And so kind of the context and then your goals, that's where you can be the visionary leader. And then what we noticed all the effective leaders doing at that moment was then not sharing the tactics, not saying, and so here's the plan I've come up with for how we're going to achieve that goal. That shuts things down. What the effective leaders did in uncertainty was then flip it to an invitation to say, I don't know exactly how we're going to get there. I think we should start here. I think we should try some things, but I particularly want your input. I want ideas from the team or from the organization to figure out how to do this. And so when we thought about that, we realized we could make an acronym there. Unfortunately, the acronym is already taken and means something else, but CGI, like context, goals, invitation, was the pattern. So CGI, share your context, be very open and transparent about that. Be inspirational and visionary about your goals and the outcome, but then flip to that invitation and to say, how do you think we could approach getting there? Because this is a complex situation and multiple perspectives are needed to be successful here. So that was a really useful pattern that emerged from that session for me.
Existing community members can access links to the recordings on our community space. Our communities, all four of these, are made up of different groups of alumni of our courses or of our annual conference. So if that's you and you want to get in on these discussions as they happen, reach out and we'll get you the info to register for the appropriate community or communities.